Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. I am your host and guide, Mr. Crispy, speaking to you through uncanny frequencies and sharing with you stories strange, fascinating, and terrifying. The views and opinions expressed on air are solely those of the speaker. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour is an entertainment program, and any similarities to any person living or dead, or any place or events, are entirely coincidental. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was created except as indicated by Non-Henshaw. Listener discretion is advised. And now, take Mr. Crispy's moldering hand in yours, ignore that tacky fluid under my nails, and join me for the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. Dawn sparked electric across the cityscape of Sai Privyeb as Detective Fung stubbed out another cigarette into his glass ashtray. 36 years working the night shift had permanently rewired Fung's circadian rhythms so that he was getting ready to turn in for the 3 or 4 hours of sleep his addled mind allowed him. He had retired 5 years ago from the force, but still some cases haunted him. Tonight had been one of those nights where one case in particular rolled itself marble-like around his skull, and no amount of tranquilizers or gin could keep it from bouncing around, lighting up new impressions and should've, could've's. Fung's reflux attacked at the memory of his dealings with Krekt and its adherents, and he opened his pill case, palming a handful of antacids that provided only temporary relief. She was a beautiful corpse named Jill or Gail, something with an L sound to it. He couldn't remember it now. What he did remember was the auburn hair, how it fell into the gray puddles of rain, how her nose was bent as though it had been broken before. Her emerald eyes, wide open, staring at some horror. Her mouth, what had been done to her mouth to distort it into a violent grimace, teeth askew, lips and gums bloody. The rest of her was spread down the boulevard, ravaged and blasphemed. Strung through and wound around with power lines, a marionette that was now and forevermore lifeless. He had coughed at the sight, and already suspicions bloomed in his mind of who had done this to the poor girl and for what purpose. The fact of the matter was, this was an escalation, a breach of the contract between the Krektist cultists and the government of Herklan Oblast. Of course, the cultists in large part were the government of Herklan Oblast, a fact he had only learned after too many years running up against the collective time and again, seeking justice for the spilt blood of its citizens and finding either deaf ears or, more commonly, cold indifference to his findings. Most of the time, the perpetrators of these abominations would end up sacrificing themselves to Krekt, a final act of martyrdom that meant no one was left to pay directly for the pain and suffering of the victims. Jill's, Gail's, George's, Jack's. Too many innocents were served up on a killing altar to the mad demigod, in return for what exactly? Herklan Oblast media broadcast lies to their populace about low crime rates, low corruption, and low taxes. But as anyone from neighboring oblasts could contest, the region was bereft and listless. All of the jobs had long went away, and while the crime rate was relatively lower than, say, Fronthule's crime rate, the nature and severity of the crimes there was a different order of magnitude. As for corruption, he certainly thought there was a rot in the souls of the powers that animated their every action, every piece of legislation, every affront to order that spread stochastically over every centimeter of the city. And Jill Gale, she was just another body on the pile. Strung sections of her body burnt black with the blue arcs of electricity that still traveled the wires. Vert Officer Megadeth calculated the probabilities that the victim had been dead prior to the maiming at 45%, a grim reality that the cultists could collect some of her suffering energy into the batteries that fed their mad deity before she had perished. The utility dialed Megadeth's modem, indicating the power was cut so they could begin the process of putting Jill Gale together again, to see if they could make head or tail of identifying the body, contacting the next of kin, and looking for clues. Medical examiners made their measurements, their notes, and carted the remains back to the morgue for further investigation. Meanwhile, Fung tried in vain to collect any remaining physical evidence for the files, but was stymied by the rain that washed the dirty alley clean, or what passed for clean, in the Herklon Oblast. At the morgue, there was a similar dearth of evidence that could have given the investigation a clear direction. The cuts to the body didn't leave metal or grain fibers that would indicate the killing tool used. The killing weapon appeared to be a blunt object concaving the skull right at the base of the neck, along with the jaw. She suffered, and Fung hated that. Sometimes the bodies he saw were at peace, but even in the clinical environment of the morgue, body cleaned with blue antiseptic, it didn't blot out the violent way she died, and it didn't diminish the trauma she underwent. No doubt, she was still suffering now, and that would reverberate and resonate as her loved ones were notified. Cruel Krecht would no doubt be pleased with this offering. Jill Gale had a tattoo just below her right clavicle. It was an angel with piercing blue eyes and 2 sets of wings. The immediate association Detective Fung made was with a moth more than a human, but the face bore a resemblance he couldn't quite place. He took a photo, which he then hung on his cubicle wall, a reminder for years to come of a case that he wasn't able to solve. That angel reminded him of his limitations, and stoked the fire that kept Fung on the force until his retirement. To be sure, Detective Fung did solve many more cases than he didn't, and often got sea justice meted out. Sometimes, the criminals did reform their ways and became upstanding citizens of the Oblast, but any pride he felt was fleeting at best. The cases he didn't solve haunted him, and when he did retire, a sour feeling stirred in his guts, knowing that the cases would likely remain cold and unsolved by the next detective, the next regime. This was the way, though. No one was perfect, and sometimes the bad guys got away, or didn't face the consequences of their actions. As he prepared for bed, he went to the bathroom and washed his face. He needed to shave. He looked older than his 65 years. He was about to click off the light when movement caught his attention in the mirror. Over his right shoulder, there was a figure seeming to hover there. Fung focused his eyes and recognized it as it resolved from the gloom. The tattoo of Jill Gale was reflected in the mirror. His heart skipped a beat. He must be overtired, he thought, or maybe had one too many gins last night. But then the figure spoke to him.
Detective Fung,
it said slowly, voice creaking like a rusty hinge.
We've been watching you, wondering where you have been.
Fung's eyes widened. He was too stunned to reply.
No need to speak, Detective Fung. Detective Igor Fung.
It had a mocking, sing-song kind of rhythm to its speech.
We are communicating on another level. Mind to mind might be the easiest way to think of it. We are here to grant you a gift we believe you will appreciate.
A soft, breathy chuckle followed. The tattoo remained mostly stationary, but did occasionally bob. Feng stayed silent as the tattoo continued on.
Detective Feng, we have encountered one another many times before. You knew me by many names, correct by fool. And of course our emissaries and missionaries, our hosts.
It drew out the S's of hosts in a truly sinister sibilance.
This host proved to be especially persistent to you, though. I believe it has been dozen cycles since you were introduced. This one was devoted, to be sure.
The tattoo now seemed to dilate or come closer to Feng's sweating head. Goose flesh rose on the back of Feng's neck as the entity continued its monologue.
Oh, I know you didn't know. Or maybe in the recesses of your sane mind, you knew but didn't want to admit. Well, now you will receive the gift of knowledge. Knowledge that this disciple, this young one, was so devoted to us that they, well...
It trailed off, and Feng realized what the tattoo was saying to him. His heart sank in his chest. The revelation was crushing.
Yes, with our aid, this one made themselves a glorious sacrifice and sits at our left hand, waiting.
Involuntarily, Feng's eyes unfixed themselves from the tattoo and traveled down, seeing the wounds that the mortician stitched up, the burst pieces of flesh that showed where Gale had been taken apart, blue sparks still animating the gaps where they did not connect.
Impossible, you think, Detective Feng?
It spoke.
Nothing is impossible for us.
The last words taking on a lower and more menacing tone. This was impossible, Feng thought, but a small part of his mind acceded to what this tattoo was saying. He felt as though he was separating from himself, his mind coming apart at the seams.
Yes, Detective Feng, you are losing your mind to us. We will collect it when the time is right, when your synapses have burnt out, and when your madness has reached the right frequency for us. But now, having given you this gift of knowledge, we expect something in return. Your suffering.
Another breathy laugh.
Your suffering is what we want before we fold you into our voltaic embrace, and you become ours for eternity.
The tattoo turned and began to recede. Feng had soiled himself and was frozen still to the spot as the tattoo retreated back into the shadows, unseen but always there, waiting, watching. He didn't know how long he stood like that, but the morning sounds of the city had crept into his perception. He moved stiffly out of the bathroom and into the bedroom. On his bedside table he picked up a crucifix he owned since he was a young man. He passed it between his hands, between his fingers, tears welling up, spilling down his wrinkled, unshaved cheeks. He couldn't stop shaking. He laid down in his bed, covered his head with a pillow, and screamed and wailed until he passed out from exhaustion. My Nightmare by Dorothea Gerard. Most people have a pet nightmare. Mine consists of a single human figure sitting immovable, in an attitude which is stamped so deeply on my memory that, although almost 20 years have passed since the day on which I saw it, I could draw it today, supposing I could draw it all, down to the most trivial details of its appearance, down to the last touch of its immediate surroundings. "Do you believe in a desertion?" I asked. "Somehow that doesn't seem to me very probable." "Of course not. It's all a mixture of improbabilities. Still, there's no denying that we have had desertions, and there's no denying either that the corners of Baryuk's mouth have been going down lower ever since we got into the barracks. Homesick, I suppose." Several days passed, during which I scarcely exchanged a word with Captain Stigler. I was enjoying town life immensely, and thought no more of Baryuk. When at last it did occur to me to ask a question, I was told that he had not reappeared. Notice had been given to the colonel, and inquiries had been made, which, however, had produced a purely negative result. Nothing had been seen of Baryuk at his home. "The desertion theory must then be thrown overboard," I remarked. "How about a theft? Have you missed nothing?" Instead of answering me at once, Captain Stigler stood with his hands deep in his pockets, gazing into my face with a perplexed air. "I have missed one thing," he said at last, somewhat reluctantly. "But it isn't a thing that any man in his senses would steal. Come along, I will show you." We had been standing in the passage, and I now followed him into his bedroom. On the wall at the head of his bed there was, hanging upon brass hooks, a row of weapons in carefully graduated order according to their size. One of the nails was unoccupied. "There used to be a revolver upon that nail," said the captain. "A revolver?" The detective in me immediately pricked up his ears. "Do you believe in the possibility of a suicide?" Captain Stigler burst out laughing rather loudly. "Suicide with that revolver? Why, it would be a much simpler process to chop oneself to pieces with a blunt penknife." He then explained to me that the missing weapon dated from the time when the idea of the modern revolver was still struggling into existence, being in fact a species of crossbred production, no longer quite a pistol and not yet quite a revolver. It was solely as a curiosity that Captain Stigler had preserved it so long. "Besides," said the captain, following his own train of thought, "even though he might have shot himself, he couldn't well have buried himself at the same time, and he couldn't have got so very far either. Something would have been heard of him by this time." I could not do otherwise than assent to this, and yet the idea of the missing revolver remained obstinately fixed in my head. There passed another few days. It was in the end of September that we had come to Silberstadt, and we were now getting on towards the end of October. The weather was getting cold. "Where are we to store our fuel?" the soldiers' ladies asked of their husbands, and the much worried husbands passed the question on to the yet more worried colonel, and asked, "Where are we to store our fuel?" It was ascertained that the cellars, which were very extensive and not of much use owing to the distance at which they lay from the different lodgings, had for years past been assigned to the officers as storer places for wood and coal. Presently there came out an order which decreed that on a given day the cellars should be visited by a commission. The officer who had the day's inspection received orders to accompany the commission, and as on the 29th of October the inspection happened to fall to my lot, I thus came to be of the party. There existed an old tattered plan of the cellars, showing the various cross passages, which document was to guide us in our expedition. 2 lancers carrying lanterns accompanied us. The key of the cellar region, somewhat rusty with disuse, hung in the guard room. It was a certain old Sergeant Baum who first tried and failed to unlock the heavy iron door. Captain Wurtel, who was the commander of the expedition, had the next try with the same result. Then I took my turn, and in doing so my sword, which I had tucked under my arm, happened to run against the door, upon which it immediately swung back upon its hinges. No wonder we had failed to unlock it, since it was unlocked already. There was nothing wrong with the lock, however, as an examination proved. We supposed, therefore, that it could only have been from an oversight that the last person who had descended to the cellars, now months ago presumably, had omitted to turn the key. From the door, a stone staircase led us straight down to the lower regions. Arrived at the bottom, we ascertained that we were in a long and tolerably broad vaulted stone passage, sparely lit at intervals by grated openings from above, probably from the yard. The expedition we had embarked on was by no means a trifling one, as we soon recognized, but on the contrary a true voyage of discovery. We were in the midst of a network of passages, branching off in all directions from our first point of departure. Some of these ended abruptly and forced us to turn back again. Others took unexpected twists, which we had considerable difficulty in following up on the old map, so as not to lose all idea of locality. We had not taken very many turns round the various corners when I made a halt and declared that I could not go a step further without the assistance of a lighted cigar. I likewise offered one to Captain Vertle, who declined it with a laugh, adding jocularly that it was a pity I had not brought my scent bottle with me, as I might have known that cellars, especially when they had been shut up for months, don't generally smell as sweet as a lady's boudoir. Here was probably damp wood lying about, possibly also a few stray dead rats, not to speak of the want of ventilation. We went on for 100 yards or so, and presently Captain Vertle, who had quite dropped the jocular tone, remarked that, after all, he wouldn't mind taking that cigar in case I thought of repeating the offer. There certainly could be no doubt that these lower regions were shockingly ill ventilated. I gave him the cigar, and for a few minutes longer we moved onwards, Lieutenant Meyer of the engineers meanwhile doing his best to decipher the numbers over the cellar entrances, and to compare them by the dim lantern light with the figures on the old plan. Looking at Captain Vertle after a little time, it struck me that he was strangely white. "Captain," I said, making a halt, "I don't think the atmosphere is agreeing with you. Hadn't we better go back for a doctor and disinfectants? The air down here has been shut up for so long that it is scarcely fit for human breathing." The captain began by demurring, but ended by acquiescing, and with great alacrity on the part of all the members of the party, we retraced our steps. The doctor on inspection was fetched, and 2 more lancers with lanterns were put into requisition, and presently the reinforced expedition started once more on its quest. What idea Captain Vertle had in his mind when he called for the 2 extra lancers, or whether he had any distinct idea at all, I am not able to say. Though we avoided exchanging words on the subject, I cannot help fancying that we both had a presentiment of an unpleasant discovery in store. Probably it was for this reason that the numbering of the doors was now somewhat slurred over, and that we instinctively pushed on, bent upon reaching the extreme limits of this underground region. One of the lancers with a lantern walked at the head. I trod close upon his heels, feeling more and more like a detective on some burning quest. Each door, as we passed it, was pushed open, and a lantern held into the entrance. There was nothing to be seen, but now and then a few scattered pieces of wood, once an old tub, rotten and burst, once again the handle of an axe. Some of the cellars were still black with coal dust. We had walked for fully 10 minutes when the man in front of me pushed open another door in one of the narrow cross passages, and again held the lantern forward. At the same instant there was a crash. He had dropped the lantern on the ground and started back so suddenly that he all but knocked me over. I could hear his teeth chattering. "There's something sitting there," he whispered. The lantern had been shivered to atoms in the fall, and as we were standing single file behind each other on account of the narrowness of the passage, it took a minute or two before one of the lights in the rest could be got to the front. The cellar itself, being lighted only by a small opening above the door, was practically pitch dark. I thought that second lantern was never coming. When it came at last, this is what I saw. Against the wall opposite the door was piled a layer of firewood, which the former possessor of the cellar must have left behind him. Blotches of mildew and clumps of tiny yellow fungus had formed themselves upon the wood. In the middle of the cellar stood the block on which the firewood is split, a shapeless black lump. Upon this lump there sat a human figure, sunk as it were into itself, the head low on the breast, the left hand, the one towards the doorway, resting on the knee, the right arm hanging straight down. The figure was in shirt sleeves. I tore the lantern out of the hand of the soldier who was holding it and went a few steps nearer. The man sitting on the black had high boots on and gray trousers, of the sort worn by officers' servants. On the floor beside him lay his blue coat, carefully folded up and neatly smoothed out, lining uppermost. The cap lay on the top. A thick white spot was sticking to the block, close beside the figure, a patch of melted tallow in which the last remnant of the burnt-down wick lay all aslant. As I stepped up quite close, a small dark object dropped from the block to the floor and slipped away noiselessly among the piled-up firewood, a rat. I now perceived that the dead man's right hand, which hung straight down, was grasping some object. Holding the lantern a little nearer, I saw that it was a revolver, an awkward-looking, old-fashioned revolver. The shirt was wide open, and the left side of the chest half shot to pieces. The features of the man's face were not clearly recognizable, owing to the lowered position of the head, but the clothes and the revolver were proofs enough for me that the man sitting here was none other than the lost Baryuk. It was Captain Vertle who spoke first. "Don't touch him," he said quickly. "Don't touch a thing about him. We have done all that we have to do here. The rest must be left to a new commission." It scarcely required the captain's appeal to make us all gladly beat our retreat from the cellar. 2 lancers were posted on guard at the door, where they stood pale as death, staring into each other's horror-stricken faces. The rest of us hurried up to daylight, and I went straight to the colonel with my report. That same afternoon the facts of the case were put on paper. In my character of officer on inspection, I again accompanied the commission appointed for this purpose, and for the 3rd time that day descended to the cellar region. The inquiry brought to light the following circumstances. The revolver had originally been loaded with 7 bullets, 6 of which had been fired, while the 7th was still in its place. I took the weapon from the dead man's hand in the presence of the commission and examined it minutely. Then I lifted the dead man's head and counted the bullet wounds on his chest, and found they tallied exactly. 5 shots were placed round about the heart. It was the 6th one only that had gone clean through it. The man had sat himself down there with the deliberate intention of shooting himself through the heart, but his anatomical knowledge not being such as to enable him to hit the right mark at once, he had failed 5 times. The 6th time at last, his perseverance had been crowned with success. He must have watched for some favorable moment to abduct the key of the cellar entrance from the guard room, must then have unlocked the door and conscientiously returned the key to its place, after which he methodically set about carrying his plan into effect. The thickness of the old walls had completely deadened all echo of the shots. There followed the formal identification of Baryuk, at which Captain Stigler had to be present, and with a verdict of suicide from unknown motives, the commission finally dispersed. To me, a compatriot of Baryuk's, these motives are, however, not unknown, but On the contrary, perfectly clear. I have called attention to them at the opening of this narrative. It was neither remorse for a crime committed, nor the fear of its consequences, nor was it a love sorrow which had played any part here. It was nothing but the big town which had killed this honest, slow-thinking, narrow-minded man. He had not had enough spirit of enterprise for desertion, but he had had the horribly stubborn energy to shoot himself gradually to death with Captain Stigler's ridiculous old revolver. It is this bent figure on the wood block that returns to haunt me in my nightmares. The Return by R. Murray Gilchrist. 5 minutes ago I drew the window curtain aside and let the mellow sunset lights contend with the glare from the girandels. Below lay the orchard of Vernon Goth, rich in heavily flowered fruit trees, yonder a medlar, here a pear, next a quince. As my eyes, unaccustomed to the day, blinked rapidly, the recollection came of a scene 45 years past, and once more beneath the oldest tree stood the girl I loved, mischievously plucking yarrow, and despite its evil omen, twining the snowy clusters in her black hair. Again her coquettish words rang in my ears. "Make me thy lady, make me the richest woman in England, and I promise thee, Brian, we shall be the happiest of God's creatures." And I remembered how the mad thirst for gold filled me, how I trusted in her fidelity, and without reasoning or even telling her that I would conquer fortune for her sake, I kissed her sadly and passed into the world. Then followed a complete silence until the star of Europe, the greatest diamond discovered in modern times, lay in my hand. A rough, unpolished stone not unlike the lumps of spar I had often seen lying on the sandy lanes of my native country. This should be Rose's own, and all the others that clanked so melodiously in their leather bulls should go towards fulfilling her ambition. Rich and happy I should be soon, and should I not marry an untitled gentlewoman sweet in her prime? The 20 years' interval of work and sleep was like a fading dream, for I was going home. The knowledge thrilled me so that my nerves were strung tight as iron ropes, and I laughed like a young boy. It was all because my home was to be in Rose Pascal's arms. I crossed the sea and posted straight for Houghton village. The old hostelry was crowded. Jane Hopgarth, who I remembered a ruddy-faced child, stood on the box-edged terrace, courtesying in matronly fashion to the departing mail-coach. A change in the signboard drew my eye. The white lilies had been painted over with a mitt, and the name changed from the Pascal Arms to the Lord Bishop. Angrily aghast at this disloyalty, I cross-questioned the ostlers, who hurried to and fro, but failing to obtain any coherent reply, I was fain to content myself with a mental denunciation of the times. At last I saw bow-legged Jeffreys, now bent double with age, sunning himself at his favourite place, the side of the horse-trough. As of old he was chewing a straw. No sign of recognition came over his face as he gazed at me, and I was shocked, because I wished to impart some of my gladness to a fellow creature. I went to him, and after trying in vain to make him speak, held forth a gold coin. He rose instantly, grasped it with palsied fingers, and, muttering that the hounds were starting, hurried from my presence. Feeling half sad, I crossed to the churchyard and gazed through the grated window of the Pascal burial chapel at the recumbent and undisturbed effigies of Geoffrey Pascal, gentleman of Breton Hall, and Margaret Maltrevor, his wife, with their quaint epitaph about a perfect marriage enduring forever. Then, after noting the rankness of the docks and nettles, I crossed the worn stile with footsteps surprisingly fleet, passed towards the stretch of moorland at whose further end stands Breton Hall. Twilight had fallen ere I reached the cottage at the entrance of the park. This was in ruinous condition. Here and there sheaves in the thatched roof had parted and formed crevices through which smoke filtered. Some of the tiny windows had been walled up, and even where the glass remained, like ivy, hindered any light from falling into their thick recesses. The door stood open, although the evening was chill. As I approached, the heavy autumnal dew shook down from the firs and fell upon my shoulders. A bat, swooping in an ululation, struck between my eyes and fell to the grass, moaning querulously. I entered. A withered woman sat beside the peat fire. She held a jar of steel knitting needles which she moved without cessation. There was no thread upon them, and when they clicked her lips twitched as if she had counted. Some time passed before I recognized Rose's foster-mother, Elizabeth Carless. The russet color of her cheeks had faded and left a sickly gray. Those sunken, dimmed eyes were utterly unlike the bright black orbs that had danced so mirthfully. Her statue, too, had shrunk. I was struck with wonder. Elizabeth could not be more than 56 years old. I had been away 20 years. Rose was 15 when I left her, and I heard Elizabeth say that she was only 21 at the time of her darling's weaning. What a change! She had such an air of weary grief that made my heart grew sick. Advancing to her side, I touched her arm. She turned, but neither spoke nor seemed aware of my presence. Soon, however, she rose, and helping herself along by grasping the scanty furniture, tottered to a window and peered out. Her right hand crept to her throat. She untied the string of her gown and took from her bosom a pomander set in a battered silver case. I cried out. Rose had loved that toy in her childhood. Thousands of times we played ball with it. Elizabeth held it to her mouth and mumbled it as if it were a baby's hand. Maddened with impatience, I caught her shudder and roughly bade her say where I should find Rose. But something awoke in her eyes, and she shrank away to the other side of the house-place. I followed. She cowered on the floor, looking at me with a strange horror. Her lips began to move, but they made no sound. Only when I crossed to the threshold did she rise, and then her head moved wildly from side to side, and her hands pressed close to her breast, as if the pain there were too great to endure. I ran from the place, not daring to look back. In a few minutes I reached the balustrated wall of the hall garden. The vegetation there was wonderfully luxuriant. As of old, the great blue and white Canterbury bells grew thickly, and those curious flowers to which tradition had given the name of Marie's heart will spread their creamy tendrils and blood-colored bloom on every hand. But Pascal's dribble, the tiny spring whose water pulsed so fiercely as it emerged from the earth, had long since burst its bounds, and converted the winter garden into a swamp, where a miniature forest of Queen of the Meadow filled the air with melancholy sweetness. The house looked as if no careful hand had touched it for years. The elements had played havoc with its oriels, and many of the latticed frames hung on single hinges. The curtain of the blue parlor hung outside, draggled and faded and half hidden by a thick growth of hindweed. With an almost savage force I raised my arm high above my head and brought my fist down upon the central panel of the door. There was no need for such violence, for the decayed fastenings made no resistance, and some of the rotten boards fell to the ground. as I entered the hall and saw the ancient furniture once so fondly kept, now mildewed and crumbling to dust. Quick sobs burst from my throat. Rose's spinet stood beside the door of the withdrawing room. How many carols had we sung to its music? As I passed, my foot struck one of the legs, and the rickety structure groaned as if it were coming to pieces. I thrust out my hand to steady it, but at my touch the velvet covering of the lid came off, and the tiny gilt ornaments rattled downwards. The moon was just rising, and only half her disk was visible over the distant edge of the hall garden. The light in the room was very uncertain, yet I could see the keys of the instrument were stained brown, and bound together with thick cobwebs. Whilst I stood before it, I felt an overpowering desire to play a country ballad with an overword of Willow Browbound. The words, in strict accordance with the melody, are merry and sad by turns, as one time filled with light happiness, at another bitter as the voice of one bereaved forever of joy. So I cleared off the spiders and began to strike the keys with my forefinger. Many were dumb, and when I struck them gave forth no sound save a peculiar sigh. But still the melody rhythmed as distinctly as if a low voice crooned it out of the darkness. Wearied with the bitterness, I turned away. By now the full moonlight pierced the window and quivered on the floor. As I gazed on the tremulous pattern, it changed into quaint devices of hearts, daggers, rings, and 1,000 tokens more. All suddenly another object gilded amongst them so quickly that I wondered whether my eyes had been at fault. A tiny satin shoe stained crimson across the lappets. A revulsion of feeling came to my soul and drove away all my fear. I had seen that selfsame shoe, white and unsoiled, 20 years before, when vain Rose danced among her reapers at her harvest home. And my voice cried out in ecstasy, "Rose, heart of mine, delight of all world's delights!" She stood before me, wondering, amazed. Alas, so changed! The red and yellow silk shawl still covered her shoulders. Her hair still hung in those eldritch curls. But the beautiful face had grown wan and tired, and across the forehead lines were drawn like silver threads. She threw her arms round my neck, and pressing her bosom heavily on mine, sobbed so piteously that I grew afraid for her, and drew back the long masses of hair which had fallen forward, and kissed again and again those lips that were too lovely for simile. Never came a word of chiding from them. "Love," she said, when she had regained her breath, "the past struggle was sharp and torturing. The future struggle will be crueler still. What great love yours was, to wait and trust for so long. Would that mine had been as powerful, poor weak heart that could not endure." The tones of a wild fear throbbed through all her speech strongly, yet with insufficient power to prevent her feeling the tenderness of those moments. Often timorously raising her head from my shoulder, she looked about and then turned with a soft, inarticulate and glad murmur to hide her face on my bosom. I spoke feverishly, told of the years spent away from her, how, when working at the diamond fields, she had been ever present in my fancy, how at night her name had fallen from my lips in my only prayer, how I had dreamed of her amongst the greatest in the land, the richest and, I dare swear, the loveliest woman in the world. I grew warmer still. All the gladness which had been constrained for so long now burst wildly from my lips. A myriad of rich ideas resolved into words, which, being spoken, wove one long and delicious fit of passion. As we stood together, the moon brightened and filled the chamber with a light like the day's. The ridges on the surrounding moorhead stood out in sharp relief. Rose drank in my declarations thirstily, but soon interrupted me with a heavy sigh. "Come away," she said softly. I no longer live in this house. You must stay with me tonight. This place is so wretched now, for the time that in you and me has only strengthened love, has wrought much ruin here. Half leaning on me, she led me from the precincts of Breton Hall. We walked in silence over the water that crowns the valley of the Whitelands, and being near the verge of the rocks, saw the great pine wood sloping downwards, lighted near us by the moon, but soon lost in destiny. Along the mysterious line where the light changed into gloom, intricate shadows of withered summer brackens struck and receded in a mimic battle. Before us lay the priest's cliff. The moon was veiled by a grove of elms, whose ever-swaying branches alternately increased and lessened her brightness. This was a place of notoriety, a veritable Golgotha, a haunt fit only for demons. Murder and theft had been punished here, and to this day fireside stories are told of evil women dancing around that druid circle, carrying hearts plucked from gibbeted bodies. "Rose," I whispered, "why have you brought me here?" She made no reply, but pressed her head more closely to my shoulder. Scarce had my lips closed ere a sound like the hiss of a half-strangled snake vibrated amongst the trees. It grew louder and louder. A monstrous shadow hovered above. Rose from my bosom murmured, "Love is strong as death. Love is strong as death." I locked her in my arms so tightly that she grew breathless. "Hold me," she panted. "You are strong." A cold hand touched our foreheads so that, benumbed, we sank together to the ground to fall instantly into a dreamless slumber. When I awoke, the clear grey light of the early morning had spread over the country. Beyond the held garden, the sun was just bursting through the clouds, and had already spread a long golden haze along the horizon. The babbling of the streamlet that runs down to the Halpin was so distinct it seemed almost at my side. How sweetly the wild thyme smelt! Filled with the tender recollections of the night, without turning I called Rose Pascal from her sleep. "Sweetheart, sweetheart, waken, waken, waken! See how glad the world looks! See the omens of a happy future!" No answer came. I sat up and, looking round me, saw that I was alone. A square stone lay near. When the sun was high, I crept to read the inscription carved thereon. "Here at 4 cross paths lieth, with a stake through the bosom, the body of Rose Pascal, who in her 16th year wilfully cast away the life God gave." And now I bid you a restless night. May you cower in the corner until morning's light, and in the harsh daylight you will see no one really gets out of jail free. Thank you for listening to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was written, produced, edited, and uploaded by Matt Henshaw, except as indicated.